thought-provoking insights and some proposals at the end. Camilla, would you like to?
Yeah, I
follow
might
that?
just swap over if I may.
Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. As Angela said, I come from an organisation called the International Institute for Environment and Development. So we do have environment and development in our name, and I tend to think of us as a development organisation that looks at development and poverty reduction through an environmental lens, rather than an environmental organisation that kind of has development tacked on. I see this very much as a conversation, as the beginning of thinking, certainly on our part, of how we tie together the different strands of global debate going on at the moment around the MDGs, but also around Rio +20, about the outcomes of the climate talks, and about green economy. So I hope you'll forgive me if I don't have ready-made answers and recommendations, but I think we'll find quite a lot of common ground, certainly judging from what Jan has spoken about so far. I mean, I have to say that as a research organisation engaged in action, we've been really frustrated in lots of ways by the MDGs, largely because environment is very weak in there, but also because we see, as Jan rightly says, that it's very often politics, governance, and institutions within country that makes the big difference. And because the MDGs are very much a product of their time, a product of the end of the 20th century, a lot of those issues are seen very much through the eyes of a donor community rather than where we are today, and looking forward 15 years, which is likely to be a rather different kind of world. So I think we need to be thinking about what the world is changing to, and how to make sure whatever we put together in terms of agreed global goals responds and resonates with that different world. I wanted just to start off by looking at the different sort of terms that we tend to use around different elements of green growth or sustainable development. We've been doing an increasing amount on green economy, and I've produced this fried egg for you, which kind of shows how we see green economy somewhere between low carbon growth, which is very much focused on carbon as its name suggests, but not quite as big as sustainable development, which is so big and all-encompassing it sometimes, often, loses any real sense of anchorage. So we've been using green economy to take forward a lot of the discussions and debates that stemmed from a rather unsatisfactory global climate change negotiation process, to see if you could get a sort of positive, forward-looking, private sector-led set of activities under the term green economy. But I admit that it's a bit fuzzy in terms of exactly where it fits between those two other layers. I think we have to acknowledge that if you look at patterns of demand and consumption around the world over the last 250 years, almost all of the curves are going up very, very sharply. We live in a world dominated by humankind. It's, I think Jeffrey Sachs called it the Anthropocene. I don't want you to focus on any individual graphs there, but just get that sense of upward push. And obviously there are a number of reasons why that pressure on resources is happening. A lot of it's consumption related. But as we heard earlier on, there are problems of the equity of consumption. In lots of places, as you see here, the branch is cracking because of overconsumption of white goods. But obviously you have to balance that also with areas of the world where people don't get nearly enough in the way of goods and services to consume. And I think this question of equity has to be very much at the heart of rethinking the what comes after 2015. My colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute, Jon Rockström, produced in Nature about 18 months ago this paper looking at global environmental boundaries. And what they sought to do was to try and identify 9 different dimensions, if you like: climate, biodiversity, nitrogen, atmospheric loading, phosphorus, and so on, and to see where we are in relation to the possible boundaries for each of those global resources. And then to say, well, if we want to create a stable planetary system, we probably need to be staying inside those boundaries. Now, the trouble is we don't know exactly where those boundaries are, but we'd be safer if we can identify generally where they are and then stay within them. And he points out that not only on climate change, but also on biodiversity and nitrogen, most scientists would agree that we were way over the safe boundaries. Now, I find myself sometimes looking at that sort of thinking, crikey, we're done for. And other times thinking, well, humankind is incredibly clever, and when faced by a challenge, they've got this tremendous capacity for innovation and technical improvements that allows you to push those boundaries out. And I think a lot of the debate that we've been having around not so much climate, but around things like food and agriculture has been, how far can you push those boundaries out? Is there a limit? And if so, at what point? But I think I tend to agree with Kenneth Boulding that ultimately this is a finite world, and that despite the fact that I'm trained to be an economist, I do believe that we have to accept that we need to be considering what some of those limits might be. So what might be key elements in that green economy? Well, I think one of them is definitely reinvesting in what I call green infrastructure. Now, green infrastructure can be the land, the water, the soils, but also, of course, the vegetation that ensures that we continue to maintain a global atmosphere that is reasonably stable and allows us to prosper. All of the work around REDD and REDD payments is very much focused on tropical moist forests. But I'd like to see ways in which we can also be thinking about providing some form of carbon payment for lower productivity, but nonetheless important ecosystems such as these drylands in the Sahel, because of the importance of that vegetation and tree cover for generating greater resilience in local livelihoods. One of the key things that I think we need to be thinking about, not only in relation to climate finance, but also what comes after the MDGs, is how we can create the plumbing and pipe work that allows a large number of small-scale, grassroots, community-based activity to get funded. At the moment, it seems to me, if we take an irrigation analogy, we've got an irrigation system that takes large amounts of cash and delivers it through canals to a few particular places. I think we need to find institutional plumbing that is much more akin to drip irrigation. So another example of some of this regreening in the Sahel work, which is starting to sequester really significant bodies of carbon. Lots of interesting work around low carbon energy and mobile phones. I went back to the village that I lived in Mali 30 years ago, and everybody's now on the mobile phone. It's really impressive. But as Jan pointed out, it seems to me, and we saw that very clearly with the budget yesterday, that we're still kind of pointing very much in the wrong direction. And if I was the skipper of this particular tanker, I'd be dead worried. Where we've put together this Green Economy Coalition with a number of different organisations around the world in order to try and get thinking, particularly from middle and low income countries, into this debate around what green economy might mean. And I think that when we try and weave together the green economy and the post-MDG poverty targets, we need to make sure that we've got a broad base of consultations with people and organisations from many different kinds of country feeding into that. I think that we've got to find a vehicle that allows us to move beyond what's become a rather stultifying and ultimately a process more focused on squared brackets than making serious progress if we're going to manage to leave a world that's going to be possible for our children and grandchildren. So how do we try and tie together these different threads? The thread of Rio+20, which is due in Rio next year, and around climate adaptation and mitigation funding. I think we have to ask, how do we make sure that we can be building in what the real costs of climate change are to different parts of the world and what the cost of adaptation is, and to think about those climate finance flows not as some bit of the aid machinery, but as compensation for damage done. I think we need to move away from the MDGs as they're currently formulated, which seem very much to me like an end of the 20th century set of targets and defined very much by OECD governments and using direct budgetary support to a large extent to achieve them, to one which is very much focused on a more collective definition of what needs to be done. And it needs to try and build synergies between the poverty agenda and the need to develop much greater sustainability. At one level, I think that true global sustainable development goals would never be agreed to, because I think they would offer such a transformatory picture from our current inequalities, power structures, and interests that nobody would agree to them. So I guess we then have to say to ourselves, what's the second best set of targets that we might be able to get agreement on? And I'd be keen to kind of see what all of you have got on your lists. I think we definitely have to have an inequality goal. We definitely have to have a hunger goal, because we've not made as much progress on hunger as we should have. We definitely need something on water and energy. We definitely need something on improving women's access to education, incomes, and other services. I think we'd also need something on rights, governance, and representation, and on how you build a more resilient livelihood system. And I think we'd need to focus on how the pipes and plumbing of financial mechanisms can actually deliver to people right down at the base. I think that's
Thank you very much, Camilla. Do you want to stay there?
No, I'm going to stand up. I'm tasked to talk about climate finance because Michael Jacobs couldn't come and he knows about climate finance and I don't, so you'll forgive me, but it's okay. Neil's here and does know about climate finance. And my PowerPoint, I hope is